I'm excited today because the conversation is going to be about something that we haven't really touched on too much in the past. We've spoken to a lot of startups that are building in the space of authorization in the past, maybe three, four startups. But one that is very related, but we've not really had any startup talk about is authentication. And so that's what's going to be our topic for today, authentication, specifically for cloud native. And I have with me Florian Forster, who is the CEO and co-founder at Zitadel. That's spelled Zitadel, Zitadel. Florian, welcome. It's great to have you on this podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. So, Florian, just tell us a bit about yourself to get us started. What's your background? What's the story behind the founding of Zitadel?
Well, while my original background is not entirely in, let's say, cybersecurity or authentication related spaces, I have
Mm-hmm.
an engineering degree in vehicle electronics, so it's close
Oh,
by the security area. Nonetheless, securities in car is at least at the point where I worked in that field was not that great. So I decided to switch career paths to more of the software side. Um,
oh,
and I always thought like, yeah, authentication is not fully solved yet. I think we can talk
mm,
about that in a minute because yeah, certainly
yes,
that's
yes.
the thing that has some conflicts in it. That may saying,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, from that field in vehicles, I worked my career path into cybersecurity and general identity as a topic, and often that brings also authentication and authorization stuff with it. And my last station before actually founding the company Citadel was in a public sector company in Switzerland where we built identity stuff for the government and also a lot of cloud native solutions for the government. So
Okay.
we used Kubernetes quite heavily at that point in time, and that was around 2016. So it was in the, yeah, let's say not early ages, but yeah, it was barely when kubeadm started, right? So it was around that time.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of fun with it, and we actually built an identity solution. It was
Wow.
closed source though on Kubernetes with key value store at that point in time. That's where we also learned a lot of things about the general topic, and where we had some hunches what things should be done differently in the space. Yeah, so that's the super brief version there.
The early days. And finally, so you were building that at this previous organization, 2016, really early days. Kubernetes is just out.
Yep.
But when did the Zitadel actually happen, and what was the point?
The whole idea of let's build something more geared for the cloud native world started growing in our heads around 2019, and it
Okay.
was really just a brain thought at that point in time. But we always got struck like, yeah, other identity solutions are really notorically hard to run and operate on cloud native infrastructure, and that means like fusion of Keycloak and others. That has changed now, like as the years have gone, but it was really cumbersome all the times. And also a big thing that annoyed us in the current landscape was that the way they do multi-tenancy was either non-existing or barely something. And we always thought, okay, but how are people doing B2B cases? Or in our case there in government field, you have government to business. So you have also that multi-tenancy problem space. And that gave us just an early hunch of, hey, why has nobody cracked that space? And that's where we actually set off in 2019 tinkering around with things, but we
Mhm.
fully committed ourselves to the cause in end of 2021 essentially. So it was not like that was just tinkering around from 2019 to 2021. And after that we thought, okay, seems like there is something, we have a hypothesis on what we're going to build, and that's where we actually started to look also for investments to make it a thing that can be built and grown so that everybody has a nice solution and we have a clear idea how we can monetize it down the line. Because it's, I mean, it's not open source for free is a thing, right? But also you need to have an idea what things can be monetized in such a system. And that's where we now have a clear vision. And I think that's the most important piece for every commercial open
Mm.
source project. Yeah.
All right, all right. When I was talking about authentication and authorization, it's become kind of a ritual to sort of define the two. What's the difference between the two for those who are probably not too familiar with each of these terms or get them mixed up?
Yeah.
Uh, it's a good starting point. So why don't you briefly tell us the difference between the two?
It's a great way of doing scrutiny check on me whether I understand the field. No, no, no. I
Yeah,
mean,
so you can
the
make.
no, the bottom line of it is like, okay, authentication is to prove that I am something, and authorization generally can be summarized as I can access or I am allowed to do something. So that's the super dumbed down story, right? And then there is many more twists, because I think a lot of people also mix up like what's a user and what's an identity, because yeah, typically, right, an identity has a means of authentication, and an identity has things that it is allowed to access, things like authorizations or grants or whatever you want to call them. And I think that's the problem many people have in their heads. And it does not help that many people abbreviate authentication and authorization with auth because that just makes it more confusing. Like, now what are we talking now? Is like authentication, authorization, or is it, I
Yeah.
mean, what's a token then? Because let's say a JOT token can actually be both, right? The expression of the token itself is not explicitly tied to one thing. And yeah, so it gets a little confusing on that end. But
Yeah, yeah.
still, yeah, what the proof that I am something versus I am allowed to access something is what the bottom line is there.
Hmm. Interesting difference there about you mentioning a user versus an identity. Would it be accurate to say that a user is a subset of an identity?
I usually try to think that way of it because it makes it more easy. Typically, if we're concerned identity, it's more fields added on top of a user, right? It can be things like gender, it can be things like added metadata fields, like in which organization is that thing, and a lot of stuff. But there is also, yeah, well, if you're not going towards the academic definition of it, there is still a little bit uncertainty there because different vendors call it differently. Like
Okay.
in Microsoft land, they are more used to the word user, right? But in other systems, you tend to use the word identity. So I think nowadays it's interchangeable, even though I'm not fully hooked in it. But yeah, it's like I think that what many people now do. Yeah.
All right, all right. One of the things I've heard from someone building authorization is that what their view is that authentication is a solved problem. We figured it out a long time ago, but authorization is the real challenge today because that's much more complex. That's their view.
Yeah.
Uh, and some people may tend to have that view around.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone telling you that?
Oh well, I mean, now that's close to a religious topic there. So let me put it that way. I think the mechanics of authentication have, yeah, to 95% ish been solved. There is still a
Hmm.
lot of dangling problems, and I will share some thoughts in a minute. But let's say things like private public key, mechanics for having an underlying mechano to exchange information, whether something is something, and then you can provide a cryptographic proof, has been there. Yes, I mean that's what we can yeah, let's call that solved. The problem, in my opinion, is that the support for some authentication means is not yet fully there. And I mean, we can start talking passkeys there and the whole FIDO, like FIDO passwordless authentication schemes. It surely is there. The specification is there, and big vendors are also started to support it, right? But that does not make it like solved, because not everybody can access it by now, because there is a lot of weird problems around that. Just to give you an indication there, I mean, people use Windows Hello for FIDO passwordless authentication, like in truth it's called CTAP2. But thing is, for that to work properly, you actually need kind of a key store in your device, right? And if you don't have a key store in your device, you need to store it in a file on your computer somehow. And then the question is, okay, is that secure? Yes or no? Well, that's a religious question then. And the same can be said of, oh, can we sync private keys around devices, like for example, like Chrome does, or like iCloud keychain does, so that the user has a good convenience? Uh, yeah, well, we have a technical solution for it, but the user experience might not be fully there, or it is not available on some platforms. So that's why I'm hesitant to say it's solved. I would rather say, well, the technical means are there, but it's not fully available to many people. And what that actually leaves out, in my opinion, is, well, authentication is not only a problem towards users, right? It's also a problem in machine to machine communication.
Mhm.
And while we also have the technical means there has not yet been a clear outcome of which mechanics have should be used on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, many people to the day use basic auth for making authentication stuff happen. Some use, uh, yeah, yeah. There's so much variety there. Many people use just tokens, but that's not an authentication means per se, right? So it's a little bit wanky. Some people use private key shot as an option to make service accounts authenticate to services. So it's not. I think the picture is not yet clear enough for many people to have a clear and advisable path to go down to. And well, as always, it's a balancing score between security and flexibility, as well as reliability is a thing in there. So yeah, I would not call
Mhm.
it solved.
Okay, okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess if you're trying to do something really simple, it's easy. But I
Mm,
think that's not the case usually with cloud native Kubernetes. Things get really complex very quickly, especially things like when you're trying to think at scale, you're thinking
yeah.
of like architecture. Could you talk to us a bit about some of those challenges, more from the context of Kubernetes and cloud native and architecture, and what complicates authentication in these scenarios?
Well, I think that's down then to the discussion again. What's authentication again, right? Because I mean, the typical way something on Kubernetes deployed works like is like you have a way a user gets some form of proof that he or her is her or whatever. The point is you get an attestation. Like, let's call it token to make it super simplistic for the moment. But then that token, if you use that towards an API, or you use it in an application or whatever, it actually turns into an authorization means, right? Because showing the proof of your authentication is then authorization again. It's just not authorization like you can access XYZ, but it still is like, hey, I already proved that I am authenticated to my identity service, whatever that is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But then you use that token, and I think the typical problem people experience in, let's say, the cloud native world in general is to acquire a token. And to check tokens is to some extent a stateful operation and can be cumbersome and expensive that way. And I give you an example there. Many people now use JOT tokens as a way of carrying that information, right? But JOT tokens have expiries to them, like they can expire after a set amount of time, and it depends a little bit on the risk appetite of an application, whether that counter should be high or low. But also it is a risk question, like how long do you want that how long that token should be still valid when something happens, because it's kind of hard to revoke them. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And I think managing that underlying problem space, like, okay, which token is still valid? How are applications and reverse proxies and APIs able to check that information? And when should they check that information? That's actually the problem space I think is the most annoying to the cloud native folks as well as to classic monolithic applications, because you need to check that and you need to make business decisions when to check that. So yet again, I give an example. What we typically advise people to do is like, is the user doing a privileged action, like deleting something, for example? That's the most concerning thing typically, or doing a transaction that has a high business value. Well, then you might want to check whether that token is still valid, even though it might be a JOT token and it could technically be still valid. So that means, well, you need to take that token and bring it to the identity infrastructure you have and ask it, hey, is the session for that token still around? And if yes, everything is green. If no, you need to act on that information then, right? You need to figure out on your business logic, can I accept the risk? What should I do? Should I re-authenticate the user? Should I get the new token with a refresh token? That's also an option in some cases, right? But to me, that's not entirely a technological problem. It's more like how people should think about the space and which services need to do which job, right? And so, yeah, so that's actually the more complex thing in there. And I think what it boils down in the cloud native world essentially is you need to have a service where you can get tokens, you can check tokens, that needs to work on a certain amount of scale, because in OAuth, for example, you can also use opaque tokens, which are essentially just a string, and then call the identity system with each call. Hey, what can the user do? Can he access something? Is the token still valid? And these things. And that all depends on your security definition. It is not even a technical problem, right? But if you do that, it imposes a lot of additional load onto your identity tool, which makes it kind of crucial in what things you do, like in the HTTP path. Suddenly, the identity infrastructure is in the HTTP path, right? If you check the token with each call, yeah, your identity infrastructure needs to keep up, or you need to do caching, whatever you want to do. But that's a cloud native problem then. Can your identity system scale as well as your services? And that's actually a problem space that has concerned us for quite a lot, because yeah, we have a lot of customers running way more than 1,000 requests a second towards Citadel. And yeah, your software and the architecture needs to keep up on that end to grow
Mm.
with the customer demand, right? Yeah. I know
Yeah,
it's a long answer for a brief question, but there is some hidden complexity in as usual.
yeah, I think really explain the different layers to it really well. And I kind of have a follow-up question, which is, it seems like it's a trade-off between how much you want to prioritize security and the number of security checks, how frequently you want to do that
Yes.
versus how efficient do you want your system to be, how much do you prioritize performance or costs, things like that, or bottlenecks. You want to reduce bottlenecks. It's really a trade-off there. But could you comment a bit about some of the anti-patterns or some of the bad practices that people end up doing when they're trying to balance these two? Some of the bad calls that they may be taking, either at an architectural decision. Mostly it's architectural, but then it has consequences day to
Yeah.
day, each of those decisions. Could you give us some examples of some of those anti-patterns that maybe someone listening could say, hey, yeah, I've been doing that for a while and I didn't know it was wrong, or I didn't know it was an anti-pattern, or I've been doing that for a while and yeah, we kind of realize it's an anti-pattern, but we don't know what to do. We're looking for a solution. We don't know the solution. Could you give us some examples of that?
I think a problem I've seen over and over where I think people should think differently is how much data you cram into an access token. I have seen weird things on that end, like they cram in a lot of authorization information, for example, into a job token. And the problem we typically see there is the more information you add, the bigger the token gets. And usually you need to send that over the wire with each HTTP call, right? That makes it quite expensive at one point, especially if you have like bad connectivity or you have like mobile connections and stuff. So it actually will break your user experience at one point, and you can only go so far because HTTP headers cannot be unlimited in length, right? Depends also on your network infrastructure, how much data it will accept there. But that's an anti-pattern I've observed uh, many times by now. And I mean, there is a lot of different solutions for that problem. It can be a modern authorization service built on something like Zanzibar or FGA, like in general fine grain authorization, if your business needs that, right? That's not always the case, but it can be something like that to alleviate the problem, like calling a dedicated service essentially. Or it can also be like in um, it's also possible to link authorization information in a job token. Like you can add a URL in there and tell the application that consumes the token, hey, if you have question about authorization means, go ask there, right? That's also an option. It can be you call the identity system that gives you, like, for example, roles or additional attributes from the user, and then you can make a decision up on that. So there is a lot of options to solve that, but usually it involves two concepts: keep tokens small and cache whatever you need to cache, and make a business decision on how much risk you can accept when something changes. Like, what happens if the user permission change? How much eventual consistency can you accept? Because it's a problem that people will encounter at scale. And yeah, so that's a thing I have seen as an anti-pattern happen many times. And another anti-pattern we see more on the authentication side is people usually kill their identity infrastructure by running expensive operations against it. So like, if you have a service account that does, for example, with each HTTP call, it fetches a new token for an upstream service. Creating that token is quite an expensive operation because you need to have a cryptographic signature, for example, or you need to insert the database record, or maybe both. So you stress your identity infrastructure quite severely with that. But there can also be other means, right? You can set like appropriate expiries in tokens. You can use a means like refresh tokens to alleviate the stress a little bit. And the whole problem space just gets worse if you, for example, use something like client credentials, like username and password, to authenticate a machine. Because if you do that, the identity system needs to hash the password, right? And that's an expensive operation, CPU wise, typically, or memory, depending on the algorithm you use. And so that's also an anti-pattern that can swamp your identity infrastructure quite severely, because a service account is not like a human user. It can run like 1,000 requests in parallel to your identity system. A user will just run one operation against it. I mean, a human user can only do so much in parallel, right? The machine is slightly different on that end. So that's also an anti-pattern we have observed in let's say more scaling environments typically. Yeah.
All right, all right. To our listeners and viewers, if that resonates with you, then definitely get in touch with Florian and his team and talk about what you can do about it. I want to segue into talking about just Zitadel and just the solution you guys have built. I believe you'll give us a walkthrough in just a few minutes. Before that, though, could you give us an overview of Zitadel's approach to authentication and what makes it unique?
Yeah, well, the decision we made with Citadel is kind of in a way that we tell people, hey, we support a lot of different authentication mechanics because we want to give our users and their users essentially the matter of choice. So it means like, yeah, well, it starts with classic username password. We can do OTP by mail, by SMS. We can do OTP with by app. We can do passwordless with FIDO. So there is a lot of options there, and you can plug them together as you see fit. Also, single sign-on with OpenID Connect and SAML too is a thing. Also with different IDPs, and you can also hook in LDAP if you want to use LDAP as a source for things. But what it brings out essentially is we see Citadel clearly as an identity infrastructure piece, and so we always think in a way of it like, hey, let's provide our customers with a ready-made login that is there. You can just use it, you can configure it, and it has a lot of customization and stuff. But once you want to have more control over the user experience, we also have low-level APIs where you can build your own UI on top, which essentially means like you can get started with the Citadel hosted login is what we call it, but also you can build your own login UI, or you can embed an OpenID compliant login into your core application if you'd like to do that. So, and we have since changed the way of thinking for Citadel, and that meaning, hey, we're going more towards becoming a little bit headless on that end. Like we provide a login built on that API for you, but you can also use the API to just tailor it to your needs. Because what we figured is the typical journey of many people is like they just want to POC something and start with something and have a login, call it a day, and they just want to attach their application with, let's say, OpenID Connect or something. But once their need grows and the company grows in maturity, they want to take more control over the user experience. They want to have control on how the fields come together in the login, and they might want to do things like after a registration, they want to slap a record in their CRM. And so we thought of, hey, let's create low-level APIs for people to make that actually feasible. Like they have their own application code and they can use Citadel in a headless way as well. And I think that combination of we provide you the, let's say, turnkey login UI, and then you can still build your own is an interesting value pitch for many people because it also allows home labbers to do stuff with Citadel. Like you can just use it. You don't need to be a developer. It's sufficient if you have a little bit of DevOps knowledge and you can get it up and running quite easily. But the thing is always maturity, right? It's like the thing we see is clearly turnkey. People need to get started quickly. Then it is like customization. They want to tailor the tool to whatever they see fit. And there is a third category nobody in identity is really talking too much, and maybe we should talk about it as well. It's like there is a lot of data in identity. Why is nobody working with that data? And I have an opinion for us and the market on that. I'm happy to share thoughts, but it's always like, okay, let our customers work with their identity data again. Nobody does that. I mean, you can ask different tools in the market whether they have like an aggregation endpoint where you can ask a question like, hey, how many users have logged in the last 30 minutes, and how many users have failed in the last 30 minutes, or how many users have used XYZ. That's a question you should be able to answer as an identity tool, but so far nobody has pulled through on that end. They always tell you just slam the data in Splunk, and I hate that answer, but would be an anti-pattern then.
Wow, that's an interesting perspective. So you can actually make better decisions about with more real-time data, even that you get from authentication.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to hijack the opportunity there, but I think in identity, the thing is, you need to think a little bit of it like, OLTP and OLAP world in database, right? You have a lot of transactional stuff like authentications are going, you check authorizations, you check tokens, you authenticate users, you create users. That's a lot of transactional stuff that just needs to happen. It needs to be reliable and fast. But then a lot of, let's say, people who use identity for their work have other questions, right? A DevOps guy might want to know, hey, what's the error rate of the authentication means in the last 5 minutes? Because I want to create a Grafana dashboard that tells me, hey, how many problems I have in authentication space. Or another somebody might want to know, hey, how many tokens have been invalidly checked in the last 30 minutes? Because that's an operational metric. I want to work with that. And so to my taste, an identity infrastructure piece, which already has that data to some extent, should provide a means to query that. And to give you another indication there, I mean, security, and a security engineer might want to do forensics like, hey, who has accessed application XYZ? So why not give them an opportunity to pull that data together and then walk into, hey, that user, can you tell me what did that user change and which things he might have read? Could be an interesting opportunity. And then there is also things like aggregations, like, okay, how many users were active in an application is also a question that could be answered. And fun thing is, if you have that data, you can also build features like threat intelligence, right? Like you can crunch it through an ML model and then figure out, hey, that user might be attacked, or you can throw alerts towards a SOC system and tell them, hey, you should look into that. And what that brings is like, in identity, we should start thinking of, there is a purely transactional piece, and then there is an analytical piece. And that analytical piece can be closely tied together. And so the universal answer everybody now has is like, okay, you have your identity system there, and then cram your logs into a Splunk, Elastic, or Datadog, or whatever. But what are you essentially doing is you're ripping out all the data out of the context. And the beautiful thing in identity is like, okay, we already have SDKs in applications because they check tokens with us from time to time. Why don't we, for example, extend an SDK to also send access information to Citadel, and then can give you an aggregated report on, hey, what did the user do? And if you're going for like things like governance and GDPR and that corner of the game, you also get questions like, hey, which application has had access to the user data, right? You need to have that for GDPR reports, for example. It's something we could answer as well easily. And yeah, without spoiling the party there too much, but the way we think about Citadel is really like, okay, let's solve the transactional piece of the story, and we're close to like, let's say 70-80% there. But what you will see in the future, and let not foreshadow the roadmap piece, but we will start investing in that analytical part quite severely over the course of the next months and years, because identity and threat intelligence is super tied together, in my opinion. But yeah.
Wow, really interesting response there. Sounds very exciting. You kind of really piqued our imagination about what's possible beyond just access, basic access, that, there's so much potential to analyze all of that data and actually get value out of it that's just sitting there right now. So really interesting thoughts that you shared over there. Uh, yeah, and I'm curious to see some of this in action. If you can show us, walkthrough or a demo of, what Zitadel actually looks like, what kind of data are we seeing in the dashboard, how do we use it, how do we get the most out of it? Show us what makes Zitadel unique and some of the things that you just described to us.
Yeah, so let me put up a screen share here. So I hope you
All
see
right.
my perfect. So
Yep.
that's Citadel's management UI, so to say. We call it console. It's in truth, it's just an Angular application built on our API, because we like dog fooding. So we have an REST API as well as a gRPC API for people who are more into that, and it allows people to graphically manage resources. But don't worry, there is also a Terraform provider available because we clearly see people don't want to click everything together because that's annoying. One thing missing though, and that's something we will work on, is like a CLI that would make the lives easier for some folks as well. But so far we have Terraform, the API, and the UI. So that's what we have. And this is basically intended for like the administrator kind of type person who wants to create resources. There is also an authorization model where you can allow different people to do different things, right? But that's the go-to thing. And let's quickly talk the main artifacts we have in Citadel. We have a thing called organizations. That's basically one part of our multi-tenancy model. It essentially means I can create multiple organizations within one Citadel. There is a different how we do organizations. If you compare them to realms in Keycloak, it's not entirely comparable because in Citadel's data model, we have an instance, and an instance, for example, holds all the signing keys and is the trust endpoints for the application, and you attach your application to a Citadel instance. But then within that instance, we have organizations, and they can be used to create different means. Like an organization can be a B2C customer organization where you slap every end consumer into it and call it a day. But it can also be business partners, like you can have multiple businesses, each with their own user pool and each with their own configuration. What that makes basically is a hierarchical model. Like you have some stuff on a global level called instance, and then you can configure some stuff on an organization level. Like, for example, your B2C users might have different authentication means than your business users. And business customer A might want to use Okta, business customer B might want to use Entra ID, right? And so it goes all back and forth, basically. And the organization is just a means to express that tenancy. And so you can create like a lot of organizations in here. Our biggest customers run 2 million organizations in one Citadel. So it's been battle tested quite heavily that multi-tenancy piece works well. And that's primarily intended for cases where you have either B2B or B2C mixed scenarios. So, but I'm sidetracking here, but in my opinion, you always have a multi-tenant application, because even the simplest application, and if we make up a web shop, you have your own stuff that needs to manage information in a web shop, and you have customers. So you always have two parties already from the get-go. So you always have a multi-tenant application. I think people should start embracing that thought because it brings challenges. Like your staff might use Entra ID to log in, but your customers might want to use passwordless. That's okay. In Citadel, just make two organizations, call it a day. But if you need to build that on your own, you end up in a lot of plumbing work because, yeah, it's like you need to have policies for everything. You need to have customization for everything. You have different token lifetimes, different session lifetimes, and it goes on and on and on. The problem there is pure N over N problematics, and you don't want to build that because it just slows down your engineering. That's essentially a big part of why Citadel exists, is that multi-tenancy capability will alleviate a lot of pressure on an engineering team. Yeah. Then
all right.
What we also have is, like, we call it projects. Projects is a way in Citadel to bundle multiple applications together. To give you an example there, if you think of Google Drive, you have a mobile app, you have a web app, you have a desktop app. So that's essentially already 3 clients in OAuth speak. And these 3 clients have all their own credentials, but what they do share is some authorization information, right? Like, for example, Citadel can do role-based access control. We can totally do that. And in that way, these 3 applications would like to share that information. Like, I, as user, have access to a role, or I have a role attached to me, and that's applicable across these applications. And a project exactly does that. So I can have a lot of different client types in here. It can also be like an API that wants to check a token. Essentially meaning I can create roles here, and I have only a user role in that example, and I can assign that to users and or other organizations. And that flexibility gives us or makes implementing parties the life a little bit easier, because you can just add multiple applications in one project and call it a day. You don't need to take care of, hey, that application needs to be with that, and that inflicts a lot of small problems, especially in the OAuth world, like audiences, for example. Like you have an audience claim, you want to have multiple audiences in there because your token need to be accessible through multiple apps then. And we take care of all that stuff, so it's just there. That's a project essentially. Then yeah,
Okay.
we have users. Yeah, users is just users. We took the liberty of calling it users because we don't care too much about what identity information you are going to store. Because for us,
Okay.
it's just, well, it has a username. You need to have that. It has an ID and it has a means of authentication and metadata. You can add a lot of metadata on a user. We don't care to make it an
Okay.
identity essentially. But as an identity system, we don't think we should tell you how your identity look like, because we cannot tell. In different cases they have different needs, right? So that's what our model does. And yeah, we
So,
have just should.
would machine identities also be considered as users?
Yes, we call them service users. um,
Okay.
that's a machine identity right there essentially. And
Yeah.
that also has a username. It has, yeah, a name, a token type and stuff. It also has authorizations. It can
Okay.
have access tokens and keys, and also metadata, right? But the
Yeah.
thing is, what we not what we as a product should do, but what we should do as a collective is, the thing that differentiates a machine user, so to say, from a human user is that it has a non-interactive authentication. That's essentially it. Because yeah, you have a lot of other means, like different rate limits and different recognition means, like for attack windows and stuff. But essentially, the only thing that differentiates severely is it's non-interactive. It needs to have an authentication means that is there without having a UI of any way or form. There is you can do brackets around the statement, but human users sometimes need that as well. But there is a lot of way working around it, like device authorization grant, for example, and other things. But essentially, that's the bottom line of it. Yeah. And in
Mhm.
Citadel, we treated the both the same, from like what you.
Could you show us an example of metadata?
Oh yeah, sure. That's just key value list basically. It's like you can add here a key value list and 1 2 3 1 2 3, and then yeah,
Okay.
3 2
Okay.
1 and hello. So yeah, we just can add that on top, and you can have that information again, for example, written to the token, or you can have it through the introspection or user info endpoint. Depends a little bit on how you build your application, but it's just a way of storing additional data on a user artifact. There is some changes
Okay.
up ahead in Citadel. In our roadmap, we're going to introduce a user schema where that allows you to have even like a schema for that, because we so far had a little bit of concern on that end, that people want to define what fields are required and what are not required, and just want to give more flexibility essentially. Yeah. Um, as said,
Okay. Okay. Neat.
we have a little bit authorization in Citadel. Essentially, what we can do is role-based access control and attribute-based access control. What we don't do there, though, is we don't check all the authorization information in detail in Citadel, because to us, an authorization information, to be parsed that and to work with that, is essentially a business logic job. Point is, I
Mm-hmm.
give you an example there. If you have like an age requirement for a service, for example, user needs to be over 18, that information needs to enforce somehow. But that if you have a web shop, for example, where you sell something that needs where the user needs to be 18, it's not something the identity system should be cared too much. It's like, why should the identity system be plagued with making that decision? Because it's still the same web shop, but for some things the user can be below 18, and for some things he needs to be above 18. So the identity system should rather store, hey, the user has an age that might be XYZ, but then the business logic in the web shop anyway needs to make a decision based on these attributes. So that's where the whole attribute-based access control stuff typically gets a little bit unclear to people, but a lot of times it's a business logic decision who can access what and under what circumstances. Especially you can offload some of it in the, let's say, the whole FGA world makes it sometimes a little bit easy, but the thing is they are mainly talking about, hey, a user has access to something like an object or a resource, and that can have a policy, and you need to pass that policy, so you can offload that to an authorization service to some extent, but it's still a business logic decision to make that. And so, yeah, that's where we take the line with Citadel currently. Like, we tell people, we can supply you rows, we can supply you the attributes to make a judgment call, but we will not do the judgment call for you, essentially. Yeah. So authorizations is just, we provide authorization information. We don't do the authorization decision, so to say. Yeah. You can combine that with, you can connect it with an OPA. You can use other frameworks to make that decision for you in your application, and based on the data we have in Citadel. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Another artifact we have is actions. Actions is like, yeah, our extensibility point, so to say. You can, there is two generations of it. The first generation essentially is you can add a little bit of JavaScript code into Citadel at some points. For example, after a user registered, you can run a HTTP call to your CRM and create a record or something like that. But they're going to be superseded with the new actions version. The new actions version is essentially, you can think a little bit like a webhook. You can tell us what things you want to see on your end, and we send them to you, and you can build workflows on top. Like, we can send you all HTTP requests, essentially. Like, if you want to have the HTTP call when the user registers, well, we can send it to you. You can add and change things and send it back to us, and we process the pipeline further. And the reason why we do it that way is because we believe in Citadel should have a well-built core functionality, like managing a user resource, for example. Managing authentication means managing authorization information. But we should not do anticipate things like that people want to build with it. Like, we have seen things where people want to add a record to their Salesforce. We've seen things people want to add something else to their Splunk. People want to do both. So we should have a way to have it flexible, that they can do actually whatever they want to build on top of there. So it feels a little bit like a webhook, essentially. You can tell us, hey, if API XYZ is called, send an event there. And yeah, it can also be, it has two ways. It has a response and a request pattern, and a fire and forgot pattern, like, yeah, an event, just something happened, and we can send it to your end as well. Yeah.
All right. Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of settings. But I mean, settings is like, yeah, well, let's not wade through it. I think what makes it great though is like, yeah, you have pre-built identity provider templates here as well. You can change your branding settings for the login, like you have light mode, dark mode. You can define colors and stuff. You have a lot of text in there as well, like a lot of languages. I think that's down because we're an open source project. People happily contribute additional languages. So you have all the message texts in here. And so it helps you really get started on that end. Yeah. Yeah. And you can configure that all per organization differently if you like. But I think that's what the mental model breaks apart for many people, is like, yeah, doing that for each customer is a thing, I can tell you, for big organizations, but it needs a little bit of thinking, because yeah, it's a little cumbersome of thinking in a multi-tenant way there.
All right. Wow. Yeah, thanks so much. That was a really exciting walkthrough, and I like how it's all organized in a very systematic way. And yeah, and there's just so much possible like the metadata, the possibilities there, and even how you also, been clear that you don't want to decide for authorization, but then you're enabling authorization. So some interesting design calls there as well as you built your product. Looks really interesting. So yeah, thanks for that walkthrough. We're almost at the end of our conversation. Um, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on the road ahead for authentication as you look ahead the next year or so. You kind of hinted at it when you said it's not just transactional, there's going to be more analytical decisions being made from authentication. Maybe you want to comment a bit more on that because that is in your mind the top thing in the next 1 year or so.
Yeah.
Or do you think there's something else as well that you're watching in the space that you think is going to be really the focus in the next year or two?
I think we will see. I mean, for the space, I think we'll see more clear signals on what comes out on the authorization part of the story. Because yeah, I agree with people. The maturity in authorization is less clear than it is in authentication and user management, so to say. So we'll see a lot of growing maturity on that end. But my take on it is always like, okay, if you want to do authorization properly, you need to do authentication properly as well. Like it starts typically with you creating a user, having authentication, and then doing authorization. It does not work in any way or form. And so I
Mm,
think what will happen is either the authorization players will wade more into the authentication space, or the authentication players will wade more in the authorization space. One of which might happen down the line. It's not.
mm,
I'm not telling our story there, but I think that's what will happen to the market sooner or later. And
wow.
the reason why I think of that like that is if you look in mid market and enterprise, I as a customer typically don't want to have like five solutions just to get identity
Mm,
done, right? I want to have an
mm,
API to create the user. I want an API to authenticate the user. I want to have a create an API to check what can that user do. So I think we will see more clear signals in 25 on consolidation efforts there. And if I'm a CTO of a company, I would rather not have free tools for that. I see no need for that. I want to have something that people see as a platform, essentially, which can tackle multiple means and that is self hostable again. Because I fear to some extent that, yeah, let's say people are on the cloud, on the SaaS only train again. But then there is a lot of clear signals that people want to self host again, and Kubernetes is ready for prime time. So you can run critical services on top. So
mm.
I think that's
Yeah,
where we see more clear signals. For us as a
interesting.
company,
Mhm.
I think we'll invest heavily on the transactional piece of the story. Like the actions will be made ready for prime time, the new version. We will roll out a new login UI in a few built on Next.js, so people have something to work with from the get go as well. Like they can fork it and do whatever they wish to do. And
Mm,
also user schema will land from our end, like that you can also define your own user schemas. And there is more in the pipeline. But what we will start working on is also like, okay, how can we bring together the analytical view there? Because nobody has done that. I think that it's super cumbersome to people. Like, I just want to know how many users have been active in my system, and I want to define what's active. That's not like up to the provider. So that whole analytical segment will be something where we will work on in the next year quite severely as well, because there is a lot of value in that data. And yeah, well, nobody tapped into it right now. Everybody just slaps it in Splunk or Elastic, and I find that kind of weird because you will spend a lot of engineering hours to rebuild that data, like, because you get an ID. Okay, what's that ID? Is that the user ID? Is it the client ID? You need to understand that data to make it usable again, and that's a lot of engineering work. So why not just collocate that with your identity infrastructure, which already knows what it is? And so that's my way of thinking there for the future, basically.
all right. So a lot of consolidation ahead.
I
Yeah.
think so. Sooner or later, yes, and I think it's a good thing. It's not even a bad thing.
Yeah.
Big the reason I'm telling it that way is like, yeah, not everybody is Google, right, and has its own authorization specific service. And that's
Mm,
the top of the 1% companies who will have that requirement. But what happens to the other 99%?
yeah.
Yeah, it's like, what do these folks do? Yeah, that's a question I think is worth talking about.
Wow. Yeah. Some interesting views there. Before you go, Florian, just a question to get to know you a bit. What would be your alternate career path if not for your job in tech?
Oh, well, can I say two? No, actually, I had three hunches during my life. What? Let's say two I put aside, and one I think I will do at one point. No, I'm super interested in helicopters, so I wanted to be a pilot at one point in my early life. I have set that aside because I think a helicopter pilot is a glorified bus driver now, and so I don't think that's so interesting. And yeah, it's like, and I don't take it as insult for these people, but you fly from A to B, you do tasks, that's it. So that it's
Right.
not recreational, and that I think that got me. I wanted
Mm,
to do um, I think yeah, the cheap shot would be bodyguard is the wrong thing, but I worked in security for quite a while, like military security. So I wanted to go down the career path of personal protection at one point in my career when I was really young. So that was a thing. And now, looking forward, I really enjoy IT and software in general, but I think an interesting thing to be would be growing citrus fruits. I have a thing for citrus fruits now.
Interesting. You know?
So maybe I grow citrus fruits at one point in my life.
Wow, those are some really varied interests, but yeah, quite a fascinating character.
Yeah, it's a wide variety.
Seems like you give this a lot of thought. What should I do apart from my work?
Yeah, I mean, I really like computers and stuff, but I also the more I get older, I think there is something in agri tech as well, and
Mm,
I think with a lot of data you can do a lot of fun things in agriculture as well. And I know many people are working on that, but it's not like something I will do immediately. But I think it has an interest of me. Yeah.
No, no, it's definitely good to have a lot of interests. So you never really bored, so to say, when
Oh
you never
no,
have, yeah, have
I,
nothing to do. That's never a problem.
no, no, no. I have a lot of ideas. That's not a problem.
All right. Yeah, thanks for joining us on the show. It was a pleasure chatting with you and really interesting to see what you're building with Zitadel. We hope to reconnect again after maybe a year or so to see what you're up to at Zitadel and to get your views on what you've been up to and been building in the coming year.
Cool. Thank you for having me. It was I certainly enjoyed the conversation here. It was a really nice chat.
All right. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, and we'll see you on the next one.